Welcome back to the Go Draft. Term Go Draft, by the way, if anybody's interested or cares, was a term that was used a lot when I first came out here. I don't know if people use it anymore, but it meant the draft of any script, screenplay, or pilot that got the green light. So it moved the script from promising script and development to let's start writing checks because we're actually going to make this movie. And so the person who could write the Go draft was a prized commodity, often uncredited, but very well paid. My dear friend and mentor Hal Dresner wrote the Go draft on Cool Hand Luke, and because of that, even though he wasn't credited, and even though he acknowledged that the bulk of the draft was Frank Pearson's, Hal got a lot of movies made from the late '60s to the early '80s. Frankly, most of them not as good as Cool Hand Luke, but still, he had a very good career. Um, so that's why I call it this. To recap a bit, we were talking about the steps, the process of how you go about structuring a movie starting from zero. And we talked about the moment, the thing that got you excited, how precious that is, and how you want to remember it and honor it. We talked about generating beats, thoughts, ideas, anything, exploring where the directions of this particular idea might take you. And out of that, starting to coalesce into what I call a spine or the central conflict of what you think your movie story is probably going to be. Okay, we're going to come back to the spine in a minute and to the rest of the steps, but I want to take a moment to talk about the three most important words in storytelling because it's going to affect how you go about structuring your story. And those three words are what happens next. What happens next is what the audience has to constantly be asking themselves from the beginning of the film to right up to the very end. The second they stop asking the question, what happens next, you're dead. You don't get a 2-minute grace period. You don't get to go off and explore something that you thought would be kind of interesting, even though it's not connected to the story. The director doesn't get to go off and shoot a bunch of shots of dewdrops and clouds and do a 360 pan because he always want to do a 360 pan even though it has nothing to do with anything. The actors don't get to take a 3-sentence speech and turn it into 3 minutes because they want to turn it into a festival of hammy acting. You don't get a grace period. The second they stop asking that 3-word question, you're dead because they're bored. And they're either bored because you didn't do a good enough job, you and your collaborators didn't do a good enough job of engaging them in the emotional journey of the protagonist, or they're ahead of the story. They already kind of sense where it's going, and then as soon as they sense that they're right, they're bored. It's one of the worst feelings you can have as a theater goer, unless you just have a really uncomfortable theater seat, is to be sitting there and saying, oh God, this is probably the spot in the story where the hero's best friend's going to get killed, so he's then motivated to exact revenge, and then you see it happen. Your heart sinks because you know that you're probably going to have a miserable rest of the movie. You might enjoy, maybe somebody will take off their clothes or there'll be a good car chase. But other than that, you're pretty much assured that you're not in good hands of an accomplished storyteller. You're ahead of them. Don't be boring. That is your mantra. Boredom is our enemy. Anybody, in fact, whether they're a screenwriter or a teacher or a preacher or a politician, anybody who gets up in front of people, metaphorically or literally, with a presentation of some sort, their first obligation is to not be boring. You can be insightful and funny and other things too, but first, don't be boring. To that end, here's a truism that seems like it couldn't possibly be true, but it is, and that is withholding information is more powerful than revealing information emotionally, more powerful than revealing it. For example, the absolute secret to having a spectacularly successful career as a Hollywood screenwriter is this: write great scripts. Now, the disappointment you felt at the revelation of that true information, compare it to how intriguing it was when you first thought, hey, maybe this guy actually does have a secret, and you tend to lean in. That's what the audience is doing when information is withheld. They're leaning in toward the story because they want to know. To give you an example, in the detective movie I wrote, somewhere near the beginning of Act Two, the woman's husband's disappeared. She's hired a private detective to track him down. The two of them, when they meet, there's some sexual sparks going off, and they set off together to go track down the husband. And as they leave the house together, I had the camera hold on the kitchen, and the phone rang. This is back when people had landlines. The phone rang, and it rang, and it rang, and then we cut. And I never revealed who it was. Was it the police calling with the lead? Was it the detective? Was it the husband calling to check up on his wife? Was it a telemarketer? We don't know. But the fact that it gave the scene a little suggestion of something's unsettling. Someone is out there that may come back to play into the story, and it forced the audience to lean in. Of course, you have when you do reveal information, you don't want it to be boring. You want it to be cool and interesting, and that's what you're trying to get to. The audience constantly saying, "Well, that was cool, but what happens next?" However, having said that, a perfect example of how far you can take this concept of withholding information can be found in the movie Lost in Translation from a few years ago, with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. It was a successful film. By no stretch of the imagination would I hold it up as an example of good screenwriting. In fact, it was barely written at all. It was successful for other reasons besides its story, which there virtually was none. And it was an anomaly in that regard. However, it was an example of this concept taken to an extreme, because if I showed an audience the first 20, 30 minutes of Lost in Translation, I stopped the film there, and I polled that audience. I said, what do you think is going to happen next? Probably most of them would have said, it was a love story, sort of. Most of them would have said, well, they're going to have an affair. He's a big movie star and she's not. She's just a regular person. So maybe he'll get bored with her and leave her and she'll be heartbroken. Or they're going to have an affair, but she's young and beautiful and he's kind of old. So maybe she'll decide, he really is too old for me, and she'll leave him and go back to her husband and he'll be left heartbroken. Or maybe they'll fall in love, have an affair, and live happily ever after. But probably nobody would have guessed what actually happened, which was nothing. They don't have an affair. Nobody has to leave anybody, other than they just decide to leave each other mutually. Nothing happened. And because of that, it kept the audience engaged. It kept the audience leaning in, waiting. When are they going to finally sleep together? And the answer was never. Ironically, the end of Lost in Translation is another withheld information. It was sort of a famous ending, and it ended like this. After an entire movie of withholding information, Sofia Coppola ended this film, Lost in Translation, by withholding more information. Bill Murray whispers something that we don't hear, that we never get to know what it was he said. Now, I don't consider this to be an example of good writing, but it does go to show you just how much you can get away with when it comes to withholding information. As long as the audience is engaged in the story, she got away with an enormous amount. I wouldn't advise it to go to the extreme she did, but it is an interesting exercise. Here's another example of withholding information in order to make the audience lean in and wonder what happens next. This is from the beginning of a movie, however. This is a movie called A Fish Called Wanda.
And on that point, members of the jury, I rest my case.
Hello, Wanda.
So while you're watching that clip, you're probably wondering, what does a stuffy English barrister have to do with this attractive woman taking pictures of a jewelry store? And what does she have to do with this weird guy who fell asleep reading Friedrich Nietzsche and then woke up and shot his alarm clock? And what does that have to do with this mild-mannered guy who's naming his fish? What do those four characters, what do those four scenarios have to do with each other? You're confused, which is fine, because confused is better than bored. Better than either of those, however, is intrigued. And by intrigued, I mean this. The audience, you want the audience to feel, I know just enough to pretty much be pretty sure I know what's happening, but I want to know more. In other words, I want to know what happens next. Think of it like it's like you walk into a party, a cocktail party full of attractive people, and you look across the room, and there you see the most attractive person, the sexiest person you can imagine, whatever that would be to you. And that person is chatting with somebody, and they look up and they see you, and your eyes lock with that person, and that person sort of smiles a little bit and then turns away and starts talking to someone else again. Who is that person? Did they like me? What? I just want to know. They may be laughing at me, or they may be thinking I'm really cool, but I'm not leaving that room. And that's what the audience wants. You want the audience to feel like that. And it's okay for you as a storyteller to be seductive, to be flirtatious, to be manipulative. All those things you're not supposed to be in real life, you get to be. And as a storyteller, they're required. The audience wants you to manipulate them. They want you to take them on a journey that they could never have imagined before they walked into the theater. Here's another way of looking at it. You may recall, I don't seem terribly fond of screenwriting formulas. I'm not. But here's a formula if you want one. If the letter I stands for intrigued, and the letter C stands for confused, and the letter B stands for bored, then I is greater than C, which is greater than B. Intrigued is better than confused, but confused is better than bored. Another way of thinking of this process of making the audience wonder what happens next is to think of your story, no matter what genre you're writing in, as a mystery. It just doesn't necessarily have a dead body in it. All good stories, if you think about it, are a kind of mystery. And they have a mystery, and they have clues, and they have twists, just like a mystery. So, Jane Eyre is, why is Rochester acting so weird, and what's behind that closed door? Streetcar Named Desire, is Blanche Dubois going to finally meet somebody who can take her away from all this before the tension between her and Stanley finally explodes? It's a mystery, and there's clues. Here's an example from Annie Hall, one of the great comedy dramas of all time.
Annie and I broke up, and I still can't get my mind around that. I keep sifting the pieces of the relationship through my mind and examining my life and trying to figure out, where did the screw up come, And a year ago we were in love, and it's funny, I'm not a morose type. I'm not a depressive character. I was a reasonably happy kid, I guess. I was brought up in Brooklyn during World War II.
Okay, so he just stated the mystery of this film, which was, why did we break up? He told you right up front, we broke up. Why did we break up? What did I do wrong? Where was the screw up? And it's a mystery, and there are clues throughout the mystery, and there's an answer to the mystery at the end if you're smart enough to figure it out. Okay, we're going to go back now to the spine of the story and how to use that spine to structure your film story. Coming up next.